Hi and welcome to this MCQ revision blast from Tutor to You. We're looking at Test 8 today, which is Issues and Debates. So this is an MCQ format. We're going to work through 15 different questions. I suggest that you pause the video when I've finished reading the questions, give you a bit of time to think about what your answer. Keep your score as you go along and don't forget to check out the other MCQ blasts on here. Okay, let's get going with question 1, and it's which two of these pieces of research does not link to the nature side of the nature versus nurture debate, so does not link in. We've got Skinner, Lorenz, Bowlby and Milgram. Take your time, and I want 2, so pause your video. Correct answer that I'm looking for here is A and D, so Skinner and Milgram. So Skinner, which was number A on there, is basically the role of operant conditioning in the learning behaviours, so inherently nurture there. Lorenz and Bowlby, they're both evolutionary. Remember they said attachment is an adaptive built-in process. And then finally we've got Milgram. So Milgram demonstrated it was the situation that determined how we were likely to behave, that's to say the environment. So for the nature-nurture, we're basically talking about the possibility that a behaviour is governed by nature, that's to say genes or neurochemistry, and/or by nurture, e.g. environment, experiences, etc. Now the key thing just to remember in a nature versus nurture essay or nature versus nurture question is this debate is really though about assessing the relative contribution of nature and nurture. Okay, question 2. The nature and nurture debate are both what? We've got deterministic, nomothetic, idiographic and reductionist, so I want 2 from there. So pause your video. Right, the correct answers that I'm looking for again is A and D, deterministic and reductionist. Now remember, determinism is about internal and external forces that control our behaviour, so things outside our control. The nature-nurture debate is deterministic as it says that our behaviour is caused by either our nature, that's to say an internal force, or our nurture, that's to say an external force, but both of those are deterministic. Similarly, they're both reductionist, nature reducing behaviour down to the lowest level, so lowest level of explanation if you like, which is the genes, and nurture to the middle level, which we'll look at later on, the psychological processes at work in our environment. So they're both deterministic and they are both reductionist. 3. Research by which of these people demonstrates an alpha bias? So take your time, have a look, and think about if you can demonstrate why that is as well. So pause your video. Right, the correct answer that I'm looking for here is Freud. So let's just take a bit of a look at this. So Freud said that the development of personality is different for males and females. Now we know it's different as their experiences of the phallic stage had a different focus. So for males it was about castration anxiety and resolving feelings towards the mother, internalising the male identity, whereas for females it was about penis envy, resolving feelings towards the father and internalising the female identity. He did also suggest that the identification was weaker in females, so their superego was not as developed as a result. So Freud basically said anatomy was destiny, and thought there to be genuine psychological differences between males and females, and he very much viewed femininity as second to masculinity. The idea of penis envy, for example, places a man on a pedestal. It was actually a later theorist, Karen Horney, who suggested that males suffer from womb envy, try and even out the balance there between the genders somewhat. So that's the alpha bias. So the alpha bias is to exaggerate differences between the genders. And remember, the beta bias, on the other hand, is where the differences are minimised or perhaps go unrecognised. So arguably any piece of research that uses only one gender in the sample is likely to suffer from a beta bias if the conclusions infer that the results are true for all people when the results was research was only based on one gender. For example, we might see a very different result in Zimbardo's prison experiment had he used an all-female sample or indeed a mixed sample. Okay, on to question 4 then. Which of these best describes cultural relativism? So take a moment just to read through those. See if you can also identify what the other ones are if they are not cultural relativism. Pause your video. Okay, the correct answer there is A. So B there is the definition of universality, C is culture, and D is ethnocentrism. The key thing in recognising the difference between ethnocentrism and cultural relativism, which sometimes students get mixed up, is that ethnocentrism is you seeing the world through your own cultural perspective and basically viewing that particular view, way of thinking as correct. So think about Ainsworth's conception of the secure attachment and that being the right, healthy and correct one. Now that may well be true of Western cultures, but not for other cultures whose child rearing practices are different and they value different things. Now this is where cultural relativism comes in, because it states that there are certain behaviours that can't be truly understood without an understanding of that culture. So in Van Nysendorn's meta-analysis, in the Japanese culture, they found a high proportion of insecure resistant infants. Now, we can't really understand why this is without taking a culturally relativist approach and actually having an understanding of Japanese culture. So Japanese culture uses the concept of a mei, keeping the child very, very close to the mother. Now, with that understanding about the particular culture, it then makes sense why they would have a high proportion of insecure resistant. For universality, this just refers to something that is the same regardless of the cultural context. So it's basically a universal phenomenon, if you like. For example, some sort of attachment behaviour occurs in all cultures. All cultures foster some sort of relationships. Okay, on to question 5. And it is, which of these does not describe the nomothetic approach to psychological research? So have a read through, pause your video and get ready with your answer. All right, the correct answer there is D. Now, the nomothetic versus idiographic is basically about whether psychologists, we want to go about establishing general laws and principles, which is nomothetic, or develop an in-depth understanding of unique behaviour, and that's the idiographic. So the nomothetic approach is going to favour methods that allow them to generate quantitative data, so experiments, correlations, etc. And this is really why we view it as being scientific, because these methods basically make it less subjective than the qualitative methods used in the idiographic. The problem is, though, when we use this nomothetic approach, we miss out on the individual differences between people because we're not focused on the person as an individual, but all people in general. There's a really nice link here into approaches, in particular the humanistic approach, which are a big fan of this kind of person-centered approach, i.e. a much more idiographic method. Now that might fall down in terms of it being very scientific, but it can, however, explain complicated differences between people that the nomothetic approach cannot. On to 6. Which of these could be described as idiographic? You can pick more than one. Okay, the correct answer is all of them. Okay, so they can all be described as idiographic in some way. Now, KF, remember, was a case study from memory. Little Hands 2 was a case study that you'd probably come across maybe in psychopathology or in later on in your approaches. Now, case studies are inherently idiographic as they focus on a single person or a very small group. The interesting thing with KF, which was part of the cognitive approach and Little Hands, like I said, from psychodynamic, is although they'd use both idiographic methods, they then use this to draw nomothetic conclusions, that's to say general laws. And this is often why we might criticise this idiographic versus nomothetic debate on the basis that, you know, you have to be one or the other, because sometimes we can be both. We can use idiographic to generate kind of general laws and principles. 7. Which of these best describes what is meant by levels of explanation? Take your time, have a read through, pause the video. Okay, now your correct answer here is A. Let's just run through what else we've got there. We've got B is reductionism, C is hard determinism, and D is soft determinism. Now, so what is levels of explanation? Be wary of this. It's actually named on the specification. What it means is in reductionism, there is a suggestion that there are different levels of explaining behaviour. Now, the lowest of these levels considers biological or physiological explanations, where we might for example, explain behaviour in terms of neurotransmitters. The middle level considers psychological explanations, that's to say cognitive and behavioural explanations, and at the highest level considers social and cultural explanations, where, for example, we might explain behaviour in terms of social groups. So if we take a year one topic of memory as an example, just to look at how these different levels of explanations worked, we can view this particular thing in lots of different ways depending upon the level of explanation that we're going to use here. So we can look at the highest level in terms of how culture influences our memory, and maybe looking at Bartlett's work on schema theory. In the middle level we've got the work of the cognitive psychologist who've investigated the capacity of memory, and then at the lowest level, the biological, we've got particular brain areas involved in different types of memory. So basically this is about reductionism. Reductionism is about breaking down behaviour. The levels of explanation are essentially the socio-cultural, the psychological and the biological, so the depth really of the reductionism. 8. Which of these is not a type of determinism? Biological, psychic, emotional or environmental? So just take a moment and pause your video. Okay, the correct answer that I'm looking for is C. So emotional determinism is just something that I've made up. So determinism is the idea that your behaviour is governed by internal or external forces and you don't control these. So for biological determinism, it's got behaviour determined essentially by your genetic makeup. So things like genes for intelligence, aggression, perhaps sexuality. Psychic determinism is behaviour is the result of childhood influences and innate drives, and this is Freudian, so perhaps seeing smoking behaviour as being the result of an oral fixation during the psychosexual stage. Environmental, the behaviour is caused through learning. Now on the other side of the determinism, of course, we have free will, and certainly the humanistic approach would view our behaviour as being very self-determined and not the result of any single cause. And it's important to think about determinism with some of the implications of it, and that's to say, if behaviour is completely outside of our control, it has a lot of illegal implications. So if we're pre-programmed, we can't choose the behaviours we carry out, how can we ever be held legally responsible for them? So a nice little bit of AO3 there, should you want some evaluation on determinism. 9. In discussing the nature-nurture debate in an essay, you should. So take your time with those questions, those answers, and pause your video. Okay, the correct answer there is all of them. So think carefully about what to use to illustrate it, include reference to interactionism, and C, define them correctly. And so in many essays you may be asked to refer to topics that you have studied. So it's really worth pulling these out in advance, the topics you're going to use, just to make sure you can keep your focus in essay. For example, for the nature-nurture debate, a topic that lends itself really nice is an attachment and the explanations of attachment, because the whole basic premise of this area is a discussion between whether behaviour is learned or something that's an innate process within us. So on the one hand you had the nurture explanation, which explains attachment as something you learned, maybe through classical or operant conditioning, and then on the other side you had the evolutionary explanations of Bowlby and Lorenz, who argue that it's an innate and adaptive process built into our DNA, and of course without it we wouldn't be able to survive beyond birth. So it does make sense that there would be something within us that forced us to attach to people so they could meet our needs. Well, you know, so basically we wouldn't die, because that'd be pretty rubbish in evolutionary terms. 10. Which of these is true of psychology? You can pick more than one. Okay, your correct answer is, it's all of them again. Okay, now the reason that psychology can basically cover all of these bases and has all these debates within it is because there's so many different paradigms. So it's largely dependent on the approach that you're using in terms of where it fits into these particular issues, to these particular debates. So just remember, all the approaches have their own different set of assumptions, ways of carrying out research or explaining behaviour. So it's perhaps unsurprising that Kuhn said we were a pre-science, because we don't really agree really about what constitutes human behaviour or the best way to study it. 11. Which of these best describes social sensitivity? So take a moment, have a look through the answers you've got there and pause your video. Okay, the correct answer there is B, so where there are social consequences for the participants or group of people represented in the research. Now in the specification it says ethical implications of research studies in theory, including reference to social sensitivity. So what are ethical implications? Ethical implications are basically a consideration of the impact or consequences that the psychological research has on the rights of people in the wider context. So these implications are going to be more prevalent in what we call socially sensitive research. So let's consider an example of a socially sensitive piece of research when we look at the genetic basis for homosexuality. Now this particular area of research is socially sensitive because if I go out looking for a gene for homosexuality and I don't find one, it might mean that my research is then taken to mean that homosexuality is something that's a choice. And if that's the case, then it gives weight to groups that argue that it's something that can be changed. The key thing here, we always have to keep in mind what the ethical implications of research that we want to carry out might be. And we have to do this even before we do it. So from the start, when we're constructing a research aim, we need to be really mindful of the consequences of a piece of research should we carry it out. And this even extends to where your funding is coming from for a particular piece of research that you're going to do. Skinner, for example, received a whole lot of funding to teach pigeons how to fly bombs. Definitely socially sensitive there. Okay, on to the next question. All right then, I want to know which two of these are arguably the most socially sensitive. Take a moment, pause the video. Right, your correct answer I've got as Bowlby and Milgram. Remember that Bowlby's conclusion was basically that the infant needed to form an attachment during the critical period, and if it failed, there would be dire consequences. So what he really meant was that mum should stick around, and that then had lots of implications in society for parents going back to work, because the thinking at the time was that children wouldn't be able to form an attachment. This has then kind of lots of implications in terms of the rights to maternity and paternity leave later down the line in terms of who should take it. Now with Milgram's conclusion was that the situation causes us to behave in barbaric ways. Now some people have called this the obedience alibi, and they argue that it gives an excuse to people who commit terrible acts, so basically taking the onus of responsibility away from them. And remember that Milgram was trying to understand what happened during the Holocaust and if the Germans were different, and his conclusion was basically that they were not the ones at fault, it was the situation and not them as the individuals who were to blame, and that particular explanation could be perhaps upsetting to somebody. 13. Right, quick true or false question just for these last three. First one, there may be research methods questions in the approaches section. Is it true, false, or C, why am I constantly being haunted by research methods? Okay. You know it, it's true, it's everywhere, and even though it's paper 3 and you think you've got away with it, you haven't, because research methods is going to rear its head again and knock you off your guard. Really make sure your research methods is on point, as well as your issues and debates and whatever topics that you're doing. 14. You can't get a 16-mark question in issues and debates or a STEM 16-mark question. A, true, B, false, or C, Dancho who? Okay, correct answer there is B. Kudos if you got the Dancho reference as well. That was from 2017, a lovely 6-mark question about a fella called Dancho and reference to determinism. Just remember on STEM 16-mark questions, the mark allocation is 6 marks for AO1, 4 marks for AO2 and 6 marks for AO3. And also really think carefully about addressing the AO2 component of that question. You get 4 marks there for your application, and in order to do that you have to go way beyond just mentioning the person named in the STEM. So more than just saying Dancho. 15. You can get multiple choice questions in issues and debates. Is it true or is it false? It's true, we've seen it before and no doubt we'll see it again. Don't rush these multiple choice questions. Really take the time to read through what you've been given and make sure you're up to date on all the key terms in issues and debates. Get yourself a copy of the specification, highlight every key term on there, check you know the definitions should an MCQ come up on them. Good luck with your exams. Few final tips: use your psychological knowledge from other topics. There's so much synopticity that you can demonstrate in it, and it's what's going to make the difference in your essays. Do not get your debates mixed up, just make sure you've totally nailed them. Don't forget to check out the other MCQ blasts. All the best of luck.